attributed to a subject, because with that comes, well, legal protections for sure, but also a sense of empathy and sympathy in some cases. And so it's kind of, to be left outside of that has implications. So there's some really nice work of this outsider examples of the female dissenter. I think Naila, our host here, a really nice piece recently bringing in the kind of cultural norms. So the scene of gaslighting when certain sorts of subjects are excluded, and describes how particular aspects of the culture in Montenegro intersect with gender in this way. We recently interviewed Erica Chung, who was on the first slide from Theranos, and she explains that for her community, there were certain aspects of the Asian American community and its ideals of feminism, or femininity, I should say, and appropriate behaviour for women that made it difficult. So although she's, you know, sort of world famous as the Theranos whistleblower, still struggled with those kinds of expectations, don't speak out. So this idea that the woman whistleblower, so there's something about the Speech Act can struggle to be seen as a valid speaking subject, doubly impossible in this sense, kind of an impossible bind. And it creates this kind of apparent gap in our framing. Now, you should know there's no conclusive evidence that there's a difference in the number of men who speak out. There tend to be, in the statistics on, you know, whistleblowing, it tends to be roughly the same. But yet there's this kind of absence of a valid subject position, this kind of ambivalence around it. And I think this really comes to the fore in the extra-organizational. So in some cases, if workers speaking out does not get satisfaction within the organization and they're ignored, they're forced to go outside if they're really passionate about getting the wrongdoing sorted. So you've talked to your line manager, you've raised the issue through the official channels, no one's listening. You might reach out to a journalist and say, well, this is the only way forward for me. Journalists are really, you know, ambivalent, as you can imagine, in whistleblowing scenes, so they can provide really useful support. If your employer, which can happen, is engaged in a smear campaign against you, then the support of a well-known journalist from an established media organization can be really gold dust, really, really important. But it's also a very vulnerable position, because the journalist is going to ask you lots of questions and say, oh, well, we need to tell your story. We need to put your personal life up on the page here, or on the screen if it's documentary. So can we take a photo of you in your kitchen with your family, and let's hear your life history? And so part of the implicit deal of going public is to make one's personal life exposed. And so this can be particularly difficult. So you can imagine that in this battle, it's a battle of credibility once you're up against your employer in the public domain for who is seen as the most legitimate. It's precarious for any whistleblower, but it's a topic that's fraught with whatever existing emotions, gross stereotypes, assumptions about gender, for example, happen to be lying around. And that creates a complex situation. We all know how media representations of prominent women can, to say the least, reinforce a kind of a sense of otherness. Sexist attacks on women who are visible in public life, common, I don't need to tell you this, but it certainly makes its way into whistleblowing, but in a really odd way. So the trope here of humble mothering women is an interesting one. So media accounts of corporate whistleblowing, and this is an example from a good few years ago, 2003, this famous Time magazine cover talked about, we have Sharon Watkins and we have Cynthia Cooper and Colleen Rowley. So Sharon was from Enron, Cynthia and Colleen from WorldCom and the FBI. So these were kind of front page news, the three major corporate female whistleblowers all emerging in the same year. So there they are in Time, in the business suits with the arms crossed and the stern faces. But this kind of stern, assertive pose you see, and it didn't match the commentary at all. The Time author in the text summarized that whistleblowers who are women tend to prefer a more subtle approach, the quote is, "These women were not looking to hog the limelight." Fortune magazine then took up the story and talked about how these women preferred to fly under the radar rather than make large-scale attention-grabbing declarations. And this was kind of, presented as a good thing. And according to the Fortune article, was one of the several inherent traits that women who speak up have. Others include a motherhood gene that, prompts them to care more for others and yields an innate aversion to wrongful risk-taking. So, in other words, in these media accounts, the women whistleblowers are courageous, courage that stems from an instinctive maternalism, but essentially modest and passive people. Now, the point is that these descriptions are distinctly at odds with what actually happened in these cases. All three of these women broke ranks actively, went against deep-seated norms of silence and complicity to alert senior figures in their organizations about massive fraud and cover-up. There was very little passiveness about it. But in such accounts, this evident contradiction, emphasizing passivity while the facts say something totally different, is ignored and skirted over. And we have this kind of strange place. It seems like women whistleblowers, they can be brave, kind of, but the disclosure can't be described as the loud and challenging kind that we associate with the other read male whistleblowing figure. I won't go into it now, but if you want a nice case, not in corporate whistleblowing, but government and national security, Agostino and Pilstrup's study contrasts male disclosures. And what they really dive deep into is in that sector, national security, women disclosures can be painted as leakers. They kind of, somehow, how would you say, carelessly let the information they disclose slip out and sort of leak out of the organization, whereas in a similar situation, male whistleblowers are more tend to be called whistleblowers. And they talk about the information technology assemblage that allows that to happen. So we're seeing that these very heavy influence of gender stereotypes, it all gets a little bit messy, I think, when it comes to the woman whistleblower. They can't really exist in the terms by which we understand this kind of, by which we've been, I suppose, coached, or by which we tend to understand the active agentic parrhesia. It's a kind of parrhesia. We should probably stop using, it has been pointed out, the term parrhesia with its particular gender legacy. But that's what we're dealing with, I suppose, in the research and the theories. It's a kind of parrhesia, but it's a diluted kind, a devalued kind, a kind of a messy kind. And as I said before, there are real consequences for not being the parrhesiast and being as the full deal. I was at a talk in London 2 or 3 years ago, and Edward Snowden appeared on the screen from Moscow, and he was asked to comment on this and that from his position of having been a whistleblower. It's great. Very interesting talk, but he actually unprompted brought up another national security whistleblower woman, reality winner, and his talk was kind of contrasting what she had been through and the lack of public support, and the depictions of her is kind of less than, and her disclosures is not real proper disclosures. And even Snowden was saying what a big difference it was in how he as a public figure was celebrated and supported, and was questioning why there was so little for his kind of counterpart. And the same beyond that, the Professor Leda Maxwell's work is very good on this, bringing sexuality into this mix. And she produced an analysis of Chelsea Manning's speech in this lovely book, Insurgent Truth, and talks very nicely, conceptualizes about what it is to be that double outsider, if you like, the outsider because of the voice, but also the outsider whose very body transgresses the norms of the system. So making sense of this as we kind of work through this, I think Butler's idea of a matrix of recognizability is helpful here. So powerful discourses, these structure who gets to be seen as a valid subject. In this case, and we're staying with this idea, it's a speaking subject. Butler is talking about how obviously power shapes recognition, but it's not just that. to talk about recognition as an a priori concept is to assume a level playing field, that there's kind of an a priori agreement on what constitutes the human subject that must be recognized in order to persist. And I think what's really interesting is the conversation that she has in the 2021 book with Axel Honneth. It's Recognition and Ambivalence is the book, and they have a kind of an over and back essay kind of match between the two. One writes an essay, the other responds, and so on. But that really came out again and again, and Butler's kind of insisting, Axel, if we're going to be talking about recognition, you need to understand that the playing field is not set from the get-go, that we have to question the framing of the human before we even think about how recognition is offered. I'm not sure the point reached home, because the insistence on sort of that we would begin by doling out recognition here and there, you know, as a kind of a way to be fair and to be equal, where wasn't I think, I'm not sure how well it was received, but I think recognizability for anyone who spends time looking at this area has to come first. It's not that so the question here is, I'm not saying we afford equal recognition to the female whistleblower to enable parity with the male, as sort of maybe a Honneth perspective might say, but rather that a patriarchal censorship. I say patriarchal censorship because we're looking at the capacity to speak and not be silent because of one's subjectivity. That patriarchal censorship matrix shapes recognizability as a whistleblower in the first place. And there's something about this agentic speech act that seems to work through gender norms to a priori censor the speech of the female whistleblower. And I think, again, back to Agostino and Kilstrup's work, they introduced this idea of the matrix, and it's really, really helpful. So the second and kind of final, I suppose, last theme is around structure. We've looked at sort of culture, but as I wanted to take a kind of a fairly expansive overview of the scene of whistleblowing research, so you get a good idea for what's out there. And you can imagine, with this age of the whistleblower, as the Financial Times was telling us, has brought in a bunch of structures. They're in a boom phase. If anyone wants to set up a consultancy and go look at how to advise organizations to install whistleblowing systems or design technology systems, there's a huge boom in that area, multi-million-dollar market emerging. And with that, there's new regulations demanding change, and structure is at the center. So when we say structure, we mean the kind of official channels for whistleblowing. So what are these elements of structure? They include new rules for how you should disclose, how exactly your manager, as a worker in a university, if you're in a university, or wherever you might be working, how exactly your manager should receive and process your disclosure, how you should report any reprisal or retaliation backlash you get for making a disclosure. And all of these systems should be in place to support this new activity. So here again, though, what's not happening is decentering the scene through a gender lens. This is critical, particularly we know from Joan Acker and so much work since her early writing, that ostensibly neutral rules and policies, and this structural element is very much presented again as ostensibly neutral, but they can favour certain kinds of bodies, often male bodies. There's some really interesting research coming up. So this comprehensive study I mentioned before, Raig et al., what they found is that we might assume that if you're in a senior position in your organization and you blow the whistle, that you're safer from retaliation than someone lower down. I mean, that's a natural assumption. But actually, this study and others besides say the opposite. So while seniority, and this was a study of an Air Force unit in the US with almost 10,000 employees, while your seniority does protect male whistleblowers and reduces the likelihood of retaliation, this does not occur for women. So what the authors kind of conclude is, oddly enough, even in very senior positions, more likely to the likelihood of retaliation remains high, seniority acts as no shield to them, which is a really strange intersection of voice and structural power that the cultural norms around femininity and around passivity and around expectations, according to the author, seem to kick in. Similar studies look at whether formal power protects female moral objectors, so not whistleblowers, but adjacent. These are individuals taking various measures against unethical practices, and find again that it does not, because of these kind of cultural expectations around passivity. So this kind of exposure through the culture. Many of us look at the more bread and butter stuff. Extra organizational is the structures in place outside the organization. So if you're whistleblowing through the official channels ends up in a situation of reprisal and you find yourself being victimized or isolated, and it's not being resolved, you have recourse to go to the law to challenge that reprisal. That's an important aspect of the structural landscape in place. More and more countries are implementing these kinds of protection laws. So normally cases are heard in those informal employment relations arenas, like Britain's employment tribunals, or Ireland, we have the Workplace Relations Commission. Similar setup, ostensibly informal work issue resolution kind of settings. Now, neither men nor women fare well in these kind of situations. 4 out of 5 whistleblowers will typically lose their case, both male and female, and that's kind of standard across countries. But there's 3 specific dynamics that tend to work against female bodies in these settings. And again, there's very little research done on it. The first one is around mixed cases. So some whistleblowers bring mixed cases. That means that you've got a case for the fact that you've just received retaliation and you're being persecuted for having made a disclosure, but also you might have a second claim around discrimination, for example, for sex, sexual orientation, disability, age, race, religion. So when those kinds of cases come before the employment tribunals, they have much lower chance of success. And women, of course, tend to be more likely than men to experience harassment and bullying beyond whistleblowing. So this fact of the and this comes down to judicial lack of understanding and lack of training with these, and the complexity of mixed cases as well. The second point is around private trivial matters. And this is really key. And there's a number of people on the call who look at this in quite a bit of depth. So we have this kind of confusion around what constitutes a whistleblowing disclosure. There is a norm that says that a whistleblowing disclosure is about big, proper wrongdoing like fraud, illegality, mismanagement. And so that's what constitutes that. Anything that looks like it might be a grievance or an interpersonal issue gets shunted down the grievance route, and the protections there are often weaker and they're seen as less important disclosures. But technically, we know that many kinds of wrongdoing that might look like interpersonal grievance from the outset actually relate to serious, systemic, in many cases, illegal wrongdoing. And often the kinds of things that are more likely to occur in the case of women's experience, like widespread sexual harassment, sexual violence, can initially come to the attention of the organization and in law be parsed as interpersonal and trivial matters that get shunted down that particular route. So it leads to a kind of a diminishing of those. So there's really hot debates at the moment in whistleblowing circles where it's tended to ignore those kinds of disclosures. And so you'd often, if one brings up things like Me Too, say, in a whistleblowing discussion with other researchers, like, oh, well, you know, we don't do that. That's not whistleblowing, whereas it absolutely must be fall within that. So that's kind of a live debate at the moment. The capacity to pay. So for those of us who look at employment tribunals and what's happening, they're ostensibly informal forums. The idea is you can go in and, you know, make a case to the bench and resolve with the employer or otherwise. But they're increasingly, of course, professionalized. Women are much less likely to men, as studies are emerging just in the last 2 years, to have legal representation in these kinds of hearings. And legal aid is very difficult to come by in these sorts of cases. So with this, it's not just a gender issue. So Dawn Wooden, who I've been working with, the person who's representing Dawn in the US, in her case, for example, she's a single mother working in a precarious contract as part of the wide move towards contract jobs in nursing. And so from her point of view, the capacity to pay is much less. And that kind of, you know, from an intersectional perspective, adds to the existing kind of struggles to speak up. Another person that we've worked with, Wendy Addison from South Africa, and she had similar situations in terms of her position as a single mother and capacity to pay for so for legal issues that are no longer optional, if you like, in these kinds of forums. So what I'm not saying, it's not that, looking at this slide, it's not that the law is out to get women whistleblowers, but the experience of women looks like it can be distinct and distinctly challenging, and that's the kind of key thing. It does seem like while the bureaucratic landscape, the structure may be ostensibly neutral, talking about blind justice or, you know, impartial bureaucracy, it does not hold at all in the case when gender comes into the mix. Of course, not in every case, and we can point to sort of very well organized female whistleblowers who have a lot of finance behind them and a lot of sort of media attention that would give the lie to this kind of analysis. But in general, there's dimensions that show that the official channels of whistleblowing are coloured by gender, and we only see this through doing our decentering work of the gendered subject caught up in the channels. So if we return to this idea of recognizability, we have these patriarchal kind of cultural norms shaping censorship, the kind of speaker that we expect and what speech is allowed. And we saw already create this ultimately impossible position. And this setup is upheld and in some cases actually exacerbated by the ostensibly neutral structures. Okay, so finally, as we come to make sense of this, what are women whistleblowers actually saying about this? So I was trying to paint a landscape of some of the studies looking at culture, looking at structure. But because in recent years we've had more and more research on speak up policies and arrangements, it's useful to look at what that research is showing us that different people are saying. Interestingly, we see that women whistleblowers, when asked if you're likely to speak up or those who've had that experience and what has been important and what has helped, women whistleblowers tend to place greater importance on the presence of official channels. In other words, official structures and systems supporting disclosure. Women then place more importance on these than men do in their decision to speak out. Now, we might be a bit surprised at that given the analysis we've just looked at. But if we look a little deeper, much of that kind of support or that kind of valuing of the official channels relates to whether a woman is named or not. So the fear of one's name. So women express greater, these are some of the studies, women express greater consciousness of the implications of breaching social norms and thus the risk of exclusion by friends and family than men do. So this kind of, you know, fear of breaching norms that it will particularly hurt them and their loved ones. Women are less likely to confront a wrongdoer directly in order to rectify a problem, but prefer report to a third party. The presence of anti-retaliation provisions. So again, those are provisions in your company's policy that explicitly forbid reprisal and promise redress if it occurs to you. They're an important factor for women speaking up, but tend to be less valued when men are asked the same question. And a big thing is women are more likely to speak up about wrongdoing when they're able to report through anonymous channels or where policies give clear assurance of confidentiality. And they cite fears of the high personal cost. So in other words, men tend not to share those concerns when asked. So the point is that women perceive speaking up about serious wrongdoing to be more dangerous for them than men appear to do when we take all this together. It seems women are very keenly conscious of risk. They see they can defend, now this is the key thing, they can depend less on the informal protections offered by a culture in which one would be protected from reprisal because one is kind of one of the guys. And so women actively seek out ways to distance their own subject position, it seems, their name from speaking up, perhaps sensing that it will not be acceptable and understanding what the landscape looks like that lies ahead. Because after all, we're all workers in organizations, or if we are, we've heard stories about others who've spoken up before us, what has happened to them. Some of those others look like us, are in similar situations. And so these are some of the perceptions that people report. So it's the anonymous channel is valued because it allows the woman to decouple herself from her act, her statement of information. You kind of delegating the speak up arrangement or the channel to bring forth the disclosure. One is not that kind of, in sort of giving account of oneself, that sort of subject who the guilty subject, the accounting for the ethical breach, or not ethical breach, the act of speech, if you like. It's an odd dependence. I mean, I've just explained why official channels and structures can work against women, and here we have these being favoured. It's a kind of a painful attachment, perhaps, that at one at the same time offers protection but can exacerbate exclusion. We could think of, as Melissa Tyler has written about, looking at sort of Judith Butler's work in the context of organisations and how organisational structures and aspects can form those kinds of hurtful attachments. Sarah Ahmed's idea of the double bind, of being tied to the thing that one critiques. These are binds and dependencies that have that very ambivalent sort of position within our lives and our outlook. So the point overall is that the apparatus we have in place right now for whistleblowing, despite all the energy and efforts that are being put into strengthening protections, if we go back to our passive, devalued subject of parrhesia, that dissenter, that female dissenter, these apparatuses and structures don't really do much to turn that figure into a proper whistleblower that can enjoy the protections that others might expect. Now, we can't generalize very easily. Again, I know each context is different, and I've mentioned some of the differences. But we still, to bring it together, it is important to keep this situation in mind and to examine in more depth this interplay of a patriarchal censorship matrix of recognizability in particular scenes, and to look at the role of speech within that. So I move forward, and I'll end early because it's coming to the end of the day. And it would be good to have some time for maybe discussion if possible. So what to do? Okay, there's some changes that are being made. So a legal duty to report is something that in legal circumstances, legal discussions is being forwarded as an important move. And indeed, it's something that studies of kind of different perceptions of men and women whistleblowers tend to favour. So that means that you're in a certain role and it's part of your duty to report wrongdoing. There are roles that have that in place at the moment, like you could look at the audit function, for example, or health and safety officers, but the duty to report would be extended to other roles, so simply by occupying a role in a bureaucracy. In other words, and I think a study by Tilton looks at the moral salience idea around that. So you don't then, if you speak up agentically and exercise your speech, it's not you that's doing it. It's like, oh, it's my role, I'm legally compelled to do it. So it's kind of a sidestepping of that, taking of the position. A second massive strand of work, and again, I know many on this call and in the gender work and organisation space that look at alliances and collectives outside the formal structure, and obviously the Me Too movement and related movements were a big part of this. So when the structures absolutely fail and are so failing that there can't even be expected to even begin to support a disclosure. The idea of going completely outside of the organisation and the law, banding together in collectives and speaking up in that way offers legitimacy and support to which a disclosure can be made, and the speaker can speak from a position of outsider, but it's a collective position offering a sense of support, but also it deflects retaliation. So I was looking at one example of military Me Too here in Ireland. The Women of Honour, they constantly speak out as a collective, even using that phrase instead of their individual names. They'll say the Women of Honour say this, the women when they're asked in the media, and that kind of amazingly has kind of detracted individual retaliation for any one of them. So it's kind of been powerful. It's kind of and something that echoes like what Bonnie Honig would say about this collective agonistic politics of refusal. It's a refusal to engage with the official structures, and it's a collective refusal, and it's effective. So what I could do is conclude and say, all right, these elements offer a suture to the gap. So if there's an impossible subject position of the speaking woman whistleblower, well, these kind of offer solutions in a way. They fill out that impossible position. Maybe they form the basis of an infrastructure of resistance through a kind of recognizability, or at least a sidestepping of having to put one's name and self in that impossible position. But conceptually, like, it bypasses the problem. You know, those are borrowed subject positions in a way. They're on loan from others, the law or the collective. They allow the woman whistleblower who uses them to speak, but to speak without presenting herself as this agentic subject who speaks out of turn, out of kilter with her gendered body. So, you know, in other places I've written about the value of these as shields, but perhaps it's important to not rush to that too quickly and to pause and to say, well, if we're engaged here in decentering the ethical subject of speech and the position of the female within that and the feminine within that, perhaps that's productive in how we think about the overall apparatus. Going back to Adriana Cavarero, Butler and Honig in their feminist ethics of nonviolence, one aspect of it is this dwelling on voice versus speech, engaged in by Cavarero. I'd love to hear if others have kind of encountered it, but it's the idea that the feminine, or have worked it, or I should say in the context of organization studies, it's the idea that the feminine position is not allowed the status of speech, but is reduced to voice, a kind of a sound, a devalued sound that emanates from the embodied singular experience, which is all one is left with when one is not afforded this kind of venerated subject of speech, while the masculine is reflected in this universal figure of man, the definitive source of speech and logos. The body or its specific experience belongs nowhere in that conception. Cavarero kind of deconstructs the Western tradition as voice and how it is understood in some of its most famous texts. And I'm reading here on Hozar's dwelling on this idea of Cavarero. For Cavarero, in one of the foundational texts of the Western political tradition, Aristotle's Politics, in which he identifies logos, or reasoned speech, as the defining capacity of the properly political animal that is man. For Cavarero, Aristotle, as well as the entire Western tradition, obscures the fact that logos was, for the Greeks, both phone and semantike, and it is the latter that has come to dominate accounts of speech, signifying the reason that is communicated in speech, while a person's voice is at best understood as a mere vehicle, an embodied kind of vehicle for the expression of reason, at worst a quality that is dangerous, seductive, and properly feminine. And she traces this misogynistic history, identifying the ways women are consigned to the vocalic, but further, and I think this is the productive aspect, mining these counter histories to demonstrate the absurdity of a masculine political tradition that believes it can do away with embodiment. The stereotype that Cavarero identifies is thus stolen from the masculine tradition and mobilized as a means of bringing to an end this tradition opening a way of understanding vocality and embodiment as something more than the other of the disembodied, reasoning, autonomous man. In other words, the specificity, the embodiment, and the uniqueness of the voice being what is privileged in this alternative reading that she offers us. So perhaps it's useful as I close to stay with the trouble, to stay with the impossibility, and to explore what that tells us about right now, how we value who or what it is who speaks, whether this productive feminist decentering of the subject of whistleblowing can point to the fallacy of the parrhesiastic male hero on the slide there, the masculine figure and his microphone, and move us towards acknowledging our embodied specificities, giving rise to voicing those experiences. So I'll close here, and thank you for the invitation to talk.
Thank you so much. I had my camera off, and I'm glad I did, because I was nodding like a crazy thing, and it was almost as if my head was going to fly off like one of those little dogs in the back of a car. That was really powerful and really rich, very provocative, super interesting. I'm not seeing any hands up just yet, so I'm going to abuse my position as chair with just a quick question stroke comment. So you mentioned Sara Ahmed towards the end of the presentation. Obviously she's just amazing, and I wish I could be her. Her stuff about complaint and her stuff about being a feminist killjoy and so on and so forth, and tying in with your very clear exegesis of the idea of a valid speaking subject. When I think of somebody like Sara Ahmed, obviously she has in many ways lots of what we might call symbolic capital, because she's so incredibly well educated and so articulate and so wise, but she's also brown. And she's also a lesbian. So those things kind of, those intersectional identities just kind of cut against each other in ways that I know a lot of people on the call are more than familiar with. And obviously she, one of her specific complaints, as she styles it, is against sexual harassment and gender-based violence in organisations. And it just struck me thinking about the female whistleblowers who we know about. So the women that you name-checked and all sorts of others. As far as I'm aware, they're all white, heterosexual, and I'm assuming also cis women. They've already got so much set up. We all have as cis or women of any stripe, so much set up against us that silences us. But just in terms of that intersectionality point, I wondered if you just wanted to respond to that or expand on it a little bit.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, one of the whistleblowers I was talking about is Dawn Wooden. So she's a black whistleblower in the ICE, and Erica Chung is of Asian American heritage. And as I mentioned, in both of their cases, and many others like them, those positionalities very much shape their experiences of speaking out and how that is received. So it's very much a key part of the work is to express that that absolutely that intersectionality piece. And when it comes to heterosexuality and homosexuality and trans, I mean, as I mentioned, Leda Maxwell's work focusing in on Chelsea Manning is very interesting in terms of both the support that Chelsea receives from the trans community, but also the inexplicability as a whistleblower that she has experienced in terms of there's a very kind of masculine heritage in national security whistleblowing. You're like, from your Ellsberg down to all these kinds of figures. Daniel Hale being another example in that case or that heritage. So it is very clear that it is an experience that is by no means I really wouldn't have wanted to sort of make the point that there's only one kind of female
Oh
whistleblower.
no,
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 absolutely.
I don't think it came across like that at all. I mean, I've certainly seen Chelsea Manning being repeatedly misgendered on social media, but elsewhere as well in should we say what one might regard as more responsible media, but clearly is not. So thanks so much for that, Kate. I'm going to go to Nella, and then there's also a question in the chat from Lynn. So Nella, do you want to go ahead?
Yes, thank you, Kate, for this wonderful talk. It's a ready paper, in my view. It's so well developed, you could publish it straight away. But I was particularly taken by that kind of inner dynamic of silencing that you have surfaced in your talk. Because when we talk about speaking out, it is usually about either preventing women from speaking out, so all those kind of contextual, structural impediments to speaking out, or it's in the context of retaliation, so all those things that they suffer once they speak out. But actually you surface something really important here, and that was particularly apparent, I think, in the Times example of how even when they do speak out, even when women voice, their grievances, when they do perform whistleblowing, their voices are devalued and blunted and, decreased to the level of, I said, gutturance, like, oh, it's not something that is important. So I was just... I don't think even that I have a question. I was just fascinated by that, but maybe you could provide a few more examples, or yeah.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it's just resonant. Like, I mean, I think, as you know, was doing a podcast there with Zelda Perkins, who was the first person to kind of speak up or break her NDA about Harvey Weinstein. And actually, one of the podcast hosts, who is a gender studies graduate, pointed out, Zelda, in so many of the media representations, the language is incredibly gender. It's like you were dizzy with excitement when you learned that your case had prevailed against Harvey. Not many men are described as dizzy with excitement having just won a legal case. Just so lots of those kinds of different examples, which are more recent than the Time magazine article, which is obviously a while ago. I think what's interesting then is to look at, sort of, as Joe mentioned, some of the more traditional, say, middle class, well-educated, cis white women. Frances Haugen's example, blowing the whistle on Facebook or Meta, you might be very familiar with. But in her case, it's striking how much social capital she brings to it, how much support she has from the media, and it almost, to contrast that with the examples of others without that sort of privilege, really goes to show. I mean, in media reportage of her, it's about sort of, she, expressing how she's from a university heritage, her parents are university lecturers, and her, she's very much the acceptable face of, if you're going to be a woman whistleblower, look like this, if you know what I mean. But even she is not escaping. So the first thing that was described about her, I think Vogue magazine got the big scoop a couple of weeks after she had spoken out in October, was it 21? And the first thing they said is, so she looks like Reese Witherspoon, actually, but like a clever Reese Witherspoon. So this person had just been the first person to blow the lid on big tech. You had Shoshana Zuboff from Age of Surveillance Capitalism writing in the Financial Times that this woman has finally provided the data we all suspected was there and given us the meat to go after these aspects of big tech companies. And there she is, being likened to Reese Witherspoon. So yeah, it goes on.
I think even remotely suggesting that Reese Witherspoon isn't smart is a fallacy of some considerable measure. I also should say, I should have said cultural capital, not symbolic capital. But yeah, sort of saying, oh, she looks like Reese Witherspoon, but an intelligent Reese Witherspoon. So just doubling down.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah.
I'm going to go to Lynn and then Guy, and then I think we'd better close off, guys. Sorry, I'm a hopeless chair. Lynn, do you want me to read your question, lovey, or do you want to speak up? Do you want to whistle blow?
Hi, Kate. Thanks so much for your presentation. I really enjoyed it. It brought back many happy memories of reading about parrhesia about 20 years ago. Right. Anyway, yeah, I was just struck whether there might be different temporalities of whistleblowing. Yeah, different trajectories and temporalities of whistleblowing between some women, people who identify as women, and some people who identify as men. Has anybody done any research on it?
Can you say that a little more in terms of the temporalities then?
Yeah, I mean, Joe raised Sarah Ahmed, and I suspect some of the reasons for whistleblowing might be quite sticky effects, and how they particularly gather momentum in people's minds, and how they're treated in organizations might be slower for some people than others. And then that might the processes that are undertaken to go through the investigation and the outcome and things like that, I've got a hunch that they might be a lot slower for women than they might be for men.
Yeah, I think that there's not enough research done on that kind of bread and butter side of progressing disclosures, but you know, it is always, there's two people involved. There's the recipient of the disclosure, who's often a line manager or the person who's sitting on a speak up desk, and then there's the discloser, who has a certain subject position within the organization, and then with, say, any number of aspects that they would bring to it. And so it's exactly, I suppose, how they're perceived and the urgency of dealing with that disclosure. But also I think the key thing, as I mentioned, is and sometimes the content of the disclosure shapes where it gets positioned and how it gets parsed. So in a very kind of real way, if something is seen as kind of more of a feminine kind of wrongdoing, like harassment, or even forms of sexual violence, that is it perceived as whistleblowing and elevated in that way? It's still a question mark on that, and there's not enough kind of work being done to understand that.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for the question, Lynn, and thanks also, Kate, of course. Guy, you're last up.
Okay. I don't know, maybe we should, maybe it's been exhausting the session yet. How long have you had to talk for? Do we need another question? I don't know.
Well, you're doing the talking.
As usual. Yeah. Before I ask a question, I just want to say, Lynn, I thought you were helpfully sign language in the earlier debate, and it turned out you were doing some knitting. So I just wanted to say that observation, because I found it quite amusing. I really like the paper and the presentation. I suppose it just sparked a question, maybe something you thought about already, Kate, but I wondered if you could deepen the analysis. And so going back to Foucault and his question about who is the subject who talks. And so my question is, you know, how is truth, or at least how we think about truth and become attached to it, already gendered? So you've got this, I really understand and acknowledge this gendered aspect, but there's probably another level to it already, right? Like what do we deem as the truth, and how we express it? It's already gendered, even without this other gendered aspect to it.
So there's two ways of looking at it. I mean, so Leda Maxwell, back to Leda, but in different aspects of her work, has done quite a good analysis of the gendering engaged in by Foucault in the two books on parrhesia towards the end of his life. And in the last one, The Courage of Truth. So he's pretty selective. Like, obviously, parrhesia, as Foucault presents it, he's interrogating certain periods of ancient Greece and looking at the way parrhesia morphs between, say, the advisor to the monarch to the kind of more Socratic speaker who's a philosopher and therefore gets to speak the truth. And then there's the sort of Athenian citizen in early phase. So anyway, I won't go into that, but the point being that when Foucault selects certain myths, he selects the male figure. So, for example, the myth of the Aeon, He tends to sort of privilege the male character in that and ignores the female parrhesia, Creusa, who's actually articulating that she's been raped by a god. But Foucault doesn't consider that to be parrhesia. Parrhesia is what her son is actually articulating something or other about. I don't know what he's talking about. But it's kind of a bit of a silencing moment. But and Maxwell takes Foucault up. That's really interesting if you're keen on reading more there. But if you towards the end of the book, which was the last he published, like, you know, Foucault did sort of insist, okay, I've taken a partial look at parrhesia, but the challenge for scholars going forward is to see how this stuff how these truth games are played out in lots of different settings. And so it's kind of an invitation almost to take Foucault against himself. Joe, I know your work is very much, or the work that you know, I'm inspired by what you've done on Foucault in this way, that that to problematize the gendering within the Foucauldian text would be a Foucauldian way of reading him against himself, if you like, if that makes sense. And so, yeah, that would be, I think that's kind of an interesting invitation to us to problematize these truth-telling moments and these speech acts. And even if Foucault doesn't come out well, at least it's in the spirit.
That's okay.
Yeah.
Thanks so much, Kate. Thanks for all your questions. Thanks to everybody for showing up for what's been an absolutely fantastic third session today. We have 8 minutes. I massively apologise. Before we are going to be listening to Professor Amina Mama, who's going to be talking about building epistemic voice, reflections on transnational knowledge work, which sounds completely amazing. So thanks so much, Kate. Absolutely wonderful as always. And we will see you all on the other side of the 8-minute break. Thanks, Kate. That was fab. Oh, she's gone.
Thanks, Joe. No,
fab stuff.
Thanks, Naila. Naila, you were supposed to be resting.
She doesn't do resting.
I can't. Yeah,
I'm
bad at resting. That's true. But I also couldn't resist because obviously I wanted to hear the talk. Oh my God! So I have a full house of feminists, just as a full disclosure. And Joe is upstairs, and I have Montenegrin feminists around milling, and cameras are all on. So
That's a lot of International Women's Day energy in the house.
Yeah, it's really lovely and really great, if a bit hectic. But Kate, thank you so much. This has been such a wonderful presentation, and I hope you know, you will submit and publish it somewhere soon, because it's really well developed. I'm really glad that you're now kind of developing that gendered component of your research a bit more. So wonderful to see that. I need to go to another session.
Naila, yeah, we'll see you at the next session. I'll be driving and listening, so chat then.
All right then. Ciao.
Bye-bye.